This session, just a reminder, this session is being recorded. So please keep that in mind when you're asking questions. So throughout the event, you may ask clarifying questions, but please save sort of the in-depth questions for the end. I know that that's counter to the usual process that we use. So when we're in person, we encourage people to engage throughout the seminar, but in this virtual format, it works better, we think, to have clarifying questions, and then we'll open it up to questions at the end. If you're participating via Zoom, use the hand raising function, and I will use that to moderate questions. If you're viewing via YouTube, and I know there are more than like 100 people watching on YouTube right now, submit questions on Twitter via @PIER or email PIER_fellowship, PIER_fellowship @gse.harvard.edu, and we'll try to include your questions in the chat. Now I'd like for us all to give a warm welcome to my friend Angela Duckworth. Angela is founder and CEO of Character Lab, a nonprofit whose mission is to advance scientific insights that help children thrive. She's also the Rosa Lee and Egbert Chang Professor at the University of Pennsylvania, faculty co-director of the Penn Wharton Behavior Change for Good initiative, and faculty co-director of Wharton People Analytics. A 2013 MacArthur Fellow, Angela's TED Talk is among the most viewed of all time, and her book, Grit, The Power of Passion and Perseverance, is a #1 New York Times bestseller. Angela is also co-host with Stephen Dubner of the podcast No Stupid Questions. So we're all in for a treat today. So Angela?
Thank you so much, Tom. Tom, can you give me a thumbs up that you can still see my slides? I didn't touch anything, but I assume that those are visible.
It's like a Carolina Blue character.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, exactly. I was going for Carolina Blue. I'm glad that came in. And I wish
I used to have a car that color.
Yeah, cars used to be bad. Not really so much. I think you're dating yourself, Tom. Yeah. Well, I'm a super fan of PIER and a super fan of yours, Tom. So I'm really happy to be here together. Since we can't be together in person, which would have been all of our preference, and instead this is my bedroom. That's the little machine I use to cool my beds because I'm a hot sleeper. I mean, I hope that it can be a little bit more of an intimate and personal conversation. And we've all been on enough of these webinars to kind of dread how long it is before you get into conversation. So I'm going to try my best to have a briefer presentation than I would have if I were there in person, so that we can get to more of Q&A. And I really do look forward to your questions, and including the critical ones, because I think those can be the best ones for learning. So I talk about character as a term. I think it's a term that you either love or hate. I love it, but I can understand why people hate it. Jim Heckman is an economist who also sometimes uses the word character. I think that both Jim and I feel like it is a nice contrast to, let's call it like whatever it is that achievement tests measure or IQ tests measure. So sometimes economists, and Tom knows this well, will use the term non-cognitive skills. Then there are other people who hate the term non-cognitive skills and embrace the term social emotional learning, which I think is probably the most prevalent term in K-12 education, absolutely. I think there are other people who prefer terms like habits of mind, life skills, soft skills, 21st century skills. Though we could have a very long webinar about what to call this collection of capacities that we hope all children have the opportunity to develop and express, we would probably be in agreement, I think, about what the constituent capacities are. And so I will say that character to me is everything that a person, no matter their age, does, thinks, or feels in a habitual way that is good for other people as well as themselves. And I think that's how Aristotle meant the term. I think that's how Maria Montessori meant the term. And I even think that is how Martin Luther King Jr. meant the term when, as a freshman at Morehouse, he wrote an essay called The Purpose of Education. And he said, character and intelligence, that is the true goal of education. So pick your term. I don't think we should have cat fights over what term, and I honor actually terms that different communities of practice want to use. But I do think it's important to really honor that the whole child means, not just their test scores, but for example, in personality research, researchers might say that kids develop capacities and habits of what they call the big five. Big five agreeableness, big five openness, big five conscientiousness. These are three well-recognized domains of personality. It's called the big five because there's two other domains. One is extroversion, but I don't think there's anything wrong or necessarily better whether you're an extrovert or an introvert. So I'm going to leave that off of the table for a moment. And in personality, there's also a domain of basically being a happy person, emotional stability. And I also, again, don't think that we should, think about not being happy as something to work on, except insofar as, of course, it's better to be happy. But anyway, I want to map what I'm saying about character, an idea that goes all the way back to Aristotle, to, for example, the modern science of personality, where you do find these recognized domains, agreeableness, openness, and conscientiousness. But you could also think of these as interpersonal strengths, intellectual strengths, and then intrapersonal strengths. This is terminology that sometimes gets used. Also, the National Research Council divided up these capacities into these exact buckets. So the point, I think, is more about that there's a plurality of things. When we talk about the whole child, we talk about social emotional learning or character, that it's not one thing. And it's certainly not just grit. I prefer the term heart, mind, and will just because it has a little bit of poetry to it. But when I think of interpersonal strengths that, personality psychologists might call agreeableness, I think of them as strengths of heart. These are strengths like gratitude and kindness, empathy, emotional intelligence. Then there's strengths of mind, which again, personality psychologists may say, oh, these are personality traits that relate to openness. But these intellectual strengths are things like curiosity, intellectual humility, etc. And then there's character strengths like grit and self-control, and I would include optimism and other strengths that enable you to get things done. So when I think of my own two teenage girls, and when I think of all children, I think, how do we help them develop and express this multitude of character strengths, and how do we, as the adults in their lives, catalyze that development and expression. So here's just a slide to underscore my point. But again, I honor the terminology that any particular parent or educator prefers. I do think there's a wide agreement among really all of us that, of course, we want our kids to be givers, that we want them to be thinkers, and that we want them to be doers. To give you some sense of how this might map on, I mentioned Jim Heckman, so I'll just show you a figure from one of our early review articles. It's by the way not the most aesthetically pleasing figure, but the bars are essentially the correlations, the correlation coefficients for how these different dimensions of character or personality predict outcomes like leadership, job performance, how long you live, the grades you get in college, and the number of years of education that you accumulate over a lifetime. And you can see that we included a bar for IQs, which I hold as a contrast in a way, something that's not very correlated with any character strength. And the gist of this figure, I think, is that IQ is not the only thing that determines life outcomes, that you see substantial correlations between these outcomes and then things that are really not IQ, which again is where the terminology non-cognitive comes from, not cognitive ability. So this is only the tip of the iceberg. There is now substantial evidence that when you look at people's life outcomes, it's not only their cognitive ability that determines how those trajectories will end up. And for me, as somebody who was a classroom teacher for several years before I became a psychologist, I'm most interested in how to help young people develop these strengths. And I have a kind of a proposal that I have really no data for, but thought I would go out on a limb and suggest that there are three building blocks of any positive character strength. It's not to say that these things aren't related, like your mindsets can lead to skill sets, your context determines everything, right? Like where do our mindsets and skill sets come from? Well, they have to come from the culture and the context, etc. But I do think it's helpful to just parse mindsets from skill sets from context in the following way. I think it's useful to understand that a young person, a little girl or boy, has beliefs. That's the narrowest definition of mindsets, beliefs that you carry around with you that help you make sense of the world. And if you have a growth mindset, you might interpret getting a not so great grade on a math exam this week differently than if you have a fixed mindset. But there are other beliefs too, beliefs about, what it means when you're stressed, like, are people good or are they bad? Beliefs about groups. Beliefs about what girls can do, beliefs about what boys can do. So I think mindsets as a category are very important in determining, how we develop and express character strengths. Skill sets, I think, are different. Skill sets are not knowing that, but knowing how. And there's just a wider range of strategies and habits that we can help young people develop. And then finally, maybe most importantly, there's context, which of course is the crucible for our mindsets and skill sets in the first place. But I wanted to just highlight that, somebody who studies psychology might be thought to ignore context because we're not sociologists, so we tend not to study things like structural inequality and poverty and race dynamics. But I will say as a psychologist that I think nothing matters more than context. And I hope that this talk produces some good debate, because I actually think our whole job is actually to create context in which adaptive mindsets and skill sets flourish and lead to the development of not only grit, but gratitude and more. So I'm going to use grit as a case study. Again, not because it's the only character strength, not because it's the most important character strength, which it's not, but because it's what I started out studying as a psychologist. I think that my interest in achievement came from working in urban schools, where I was very convinced by my, just daily interaction with young people that they were really smart. But I wasn't seeing it on their test scores. I wasn't seeing it on their homework assignments. And I think what I began to understand was that, just being a really smart kid doesn't mean that you're going to be able to sustain the quality and the quantity of effort that's needed to learn. And learning is hard, but possible. So I began to study motivation and the psychology of effort. And grit is really your long-term commitment to goals and your long-term capacity to sustain effort despite setbacks. So I'll just give you a sense of where I think, some of these mindsets and skill sets and contextual factors begin to incline a student to be a little more passionate and persevering for long-term goals. And in here, I'm revealing my theory of human nature, which is that I think we're all pretty rational. When a kid doesn't do their homework, it feels to the teacher sometimes, or it did to me, like it felt irrational. Like it felt like, why didn't you do your homework? I gave you your homework. I gave you everything you needed to do your homework. You didn't do your homework, and it's not good for you. Like that seemed to me irrational. But when you really understand like what it is that went on in the life of a kid, the other things that were going on other than homework. I actually think most people are rationally responding to what they're experiencing. And so I think it's our job, again, to create the context such that, their mindsets and their skill sets are adaptive and accurate. But I'll get into grit as an example of all that. And it's again not the only book you could pull off the shelf, but it is one that I've written, so I'm happy to do it here. Even as early as 1869, scientists have debated what makes for achievement, and Charles Darwin had a lively correspondence with his cousin Francis Galton, which now more than ever, I should just give you a historical footnote that Darwin was a great scientist and a great person. His cousin Francis was a great scientist and not such a great person. You can Google him to see some of his not very humane attitudes. But in the debate they had, what I want to foreground is that they really understood, and I think it's true now given the data we've collected, that ability, like cognitive ability, like your IQ score, is very poorly correlated with measures of hard work and zeal, or in my terms, perseverance and passion. So ability isn't everything. And my favorite thinker on this subject is actually Will Smith, who's from my hometown of Philadelphia, which is where I am today. I'm pretty sure it's not where Will Smith is today, but I'll play this little clip from an interview where he's asked like why and how it is that he is so successful.
The only thing that I see that is distinctly different about me is I'm not afraid to die on a treadmill, right? I will run.
You would not be outworked.
I will not be outworked,
right?
Period.
Yeah.
You might have more talent than me. You might be smarter than me. You might be sexier than me. You might be all of those things. You got it on me in 9 categories. But if we get on the treadmill together, right, there's 2 things. You're getting off first, or I'm going to die. It's really that simple.
So I have a small crush on Will Smith. That's the other reason why I showed it to you. And by the way, I once observed him in real life. And just to speak about why I do like the word character, as old fashioned as it is, and you may not like all the connotations, but I can't think of a better word to describe how he treated other people, who weren't famous, like who weren't movie stars or directors, but he was just in this large room and everybody wanted to meet him. And he treated the waiter and the busboy the same as he treated Margot Robbie and whoever it was who was directing the movie that they were in. So I like the word character. I'll put a plug in for that. Just to suggest that when we think about that conversation that Darwin had with his cousin and this contrast between ability and what you do with it, it's not only Will Smith and it's not only Charles Darwin, but it's also Catherine Cox, who was a great psychologist at Stanford University, who at the turn of the 20th century did a study of what she called 301 geniuses, Isaac Newton and 300 others. And when she looked into their biographies, and she actually had about 8,000 pages of notes of their written letters and their diaries and so forth, she identified that separate from their intellectual ability, which was considerable, she estimated, they had these 2 qualities, which, to quote verbatim, the tendency not to abandon tasks from mere changeability, not seeking something fresh because of novelty, not always looking for a change. And that's the kind of sustained passion that I mean when I talk about grit, not necessarily intensity, but this kind of duration of being committed to something for you. And any of you, well, all of you are interested and committed to education. Nobody's going to change education in a day or a week or even a month. I mean, I think that this is the nature of hard things. And then more obviously, maybe the tendency not to abandon tasks in the face of obstacles, perseverance, tenacity, doggedness. And so if that's what grit is, this combination of passion and perseverance for really long-term goals, where does it come from? And this graphic, I thank Carol Dweck for permission to share with you. Carol's pioneering work has shown that the belief that abilities like intelligence can grow, which she calls a growth mindset, is especially protective and contrasted with a fixed mindset, believing that abilities like intelligence are static. in the context of challenge, when you're getting all A's and, you're accepted to every team and every peer group wants you, I guess it doesn't really matter that much if you have a fixed mindset or a growth mindset. And Carol reflected in her book, which I recommend, on her own growing up and how, for a lot of her life, she had been sort of a fixed mindset person, and that belief can reinforce itself. But I think it's, well, frankly, during times like these, where you're really doubting yourself, challenged by adversity that is right now, at least historically unprecedented, that a growth mindset helps because it gives you a reason to get up again. It gives you a reason to think like, well, I can learn something from that and I can grow and I can change. In our work that was funded by the Gates Foundation, we found that growth mindset and grit were positively correlated when you measure both at the same time. But in subsequent work with Annie Park and other collaborators, we found evidence for a virtuous cycle, such that when you were grittier at time 1, it predicted increases in growth mindset at time 2 in a large sample of teenagers. And if you had more of a growth mindset at time 2, you were sort of growing in your growth mindset, that predicted an increase in grit, and so on and so forth. So I believe that when we think about child development, we all see this sometimes, at least as educators and also as parents, that kids can get into virtuous cycles where their confidence and their belief in change is increasing. That gets them to take more risks and to try a little harder and to work a little longer. And that leads them to some amount of mastery, and that reinforces the beliefs. And I also believe the opposite cycle can adhere. So when I was that impatient teacher thinking like, why didn't you do your homework? Like, it's irrational. Maybe there's a belief there which is being undermined, in fact, by the opposite of mastery experiences, and leading a young person to not embrace challenge in ways that are understandable, and that we can change, but aren't irrational in the sense that I thought about it as a young teacher. I want to move on to if that's a mindset, and actually before I move on, and just going back to this slide, there's really amazing work that you can look up by David Yeager, who trained with Carol Dweck at Stanford, and a large cast of scientists, including me, but more centrally, David Yeager, Carol Dweck, and others, where in a random assignment controlled trial, 9th graders all over the United States were randomly assigned to either learn growth mindset in these like very short modules that were given over 2 class periods at the beginning of the school year, compared to a placebo control condition. And then at the end of the year, there were objective measures from school records of grades. And the mindset intervention worked. It improved report card grades, it increased growth mindset. And I think especially heartening for those of us who care deeply about the achievement gap, it really improved the grades most for the least achieving kids. And one of the findings that I think is especially relevant, given that I'll talk about context more, is that in schools that had cultures that really encourage challenge seeking, doing things that are harder, even if you're going to make mistakes, that's where the intervention was the strongest, or had the most effect. So anyway, I think growth mindset is all about how abilities can change, but I think you might want to have a growth mindset about growth mindset, that even your growth mindset should be able to change. And that intervention work shows that that's possible. I'll move on to skill sets, right? So if any character strength is not only about your beliefs, but also about things that you know how to do, strategies that you have learned, habits that you've developed over time with feedback, then, how do we get kids to begin to, for example, develop the skill of practice? Because I think practice, of course, is for developing skill, but we all learned, every single one of us at some point, how to practice things. We all learned how to study. You know, we all learned how to get better at things, and children are not born knowing this. In fact, most of us never learn to practice optimally. And this is a little laptop computer, because what we did in this intervention study that I'll tell you about is that we helped middle school students learn about how Olympic athletes and world-class performers like Will Smith practice their craft. And what we told them was that when you look at how true experts practice, they don't do mindless practice. They don't do busy work. You know, they don't spend hours and hours doing the same thing. In fact, what they are doing is very intentional. They decide on a certain sub-skill to practice. We told students in other interventions, by the way, and this is important and true, that usually you need a teacher or a coach to help you decide on that sub-skill. But once you've decided on one thing that you want to practice, you really practice with 100% concentration and focus, which to my own teenage girls, I'll say, when you're Snapchatting and texting and you have 17 tabs open on your computer, but you're also somehow watching television and playing like Taylor Swift on Alexa, you're not practicing with 100% focus. So it's that kind of concentration. And then there's getting feedback and reflecting on that feedback and repeating this, you know, over and over again. And that is what makes, I think, true world-class performers different from the rest of us, more than even their talent. So I'll give you a little video to give you a flavor for the sort of thing that we did in the intervention with middle school students, with the caveat that this video is a little bit more highly produced, and we asked Wynton Marsalis, the great jazz musician, to narrate it because it resonated so much with his personal experience of practicing like an expert.
Some people are so good at what they do, you doubt you could ever be as great. Are they born with it? Not at all. Research shows that you can become an expert too with the right kind of practice. Expert practice has 3 steps. First, take the thing you want to do well, break it down into smaller parts, and pick one part that's just a little harder than what you can do now. Second, practice that one skill with absolute concentration. Even short practice sessions are powerful if you focus completely. Third, seek feedback on your performance and reflect on that feedback. Now, expert practice is not always easy, but as you perfect many small skills, you begin to see how the whole improves to create dazzling mastery. Great musicians, doctors, writers, and athletes all use expert practice. They use it as students too. You can become great at whatever you envision. What will you choose to master?
So after learning about how experts practice, kids were, asked to go to the computer labs, and we actually designed a task where they would be leveled up in math problems that we more or less stole from the Khan Academy. But I feel like the spirit of Sal Khan lives on in these, like, I think he would endorse this. I'm not sure I ever got around to asking him if that was okay. But we leveled kids up so they were doing things that were a little bit too hard. So and that's part of deliberate practice. You know, practicing one small sub skill that you can't yet do, and then trying really hard. Now, if you look at the gray screens, those are kids who chose to do it. In this random assignment experiment, half of the kids learned about expert practice, half of the kids were in a control condition. And what you can see here is that when they went to the computer lab, some kids are, watching ESPN. I mean, it was the only day that in the school's history they had taken the firewalls down from the computer lab, and so the kids could go anywhere. And the question was, how much deliberate practice, this expert kind of practice, do you do when you're given the opportunity to do whatever you want? And here's what we found. Well, if you look at the control condition, over 3 consecutive opportunities to do this kind of practice, there's a decline. I mean, it's very effortful. It's not as fun as watching ESPN. And in the treatment group, there's also a decline, but less so. And there's a significant difference here between how much deliberate practice the kids who learned about how experts practice did voluntarily versus the control. And I will also say that this graduate student who now is going to be a professor at Booth, University of Chicago, got the schools to give her the grades. So report card grades, 1 marking period later. And what she found was, just like in the growth mindset intervention, that this brief exposure to the science of the skill set of practicing ended up increasing report card grades for particularly the underachieving achieving, the kids who are below the median at baseline, according to school records. So I believe that grit is really built on, adaptive mindsets, like a growth mindset about intelligence, and also adaptive skill sets that you only learn when grown-ups help you learn about how to practice, and how concentration is important, how doing things that are a little too hard for you are important as well. So mindsets and skill sets matter, but it all really does come down to context, because these mindsets and skill sets are incubated and encouraged or discouraged depending on your context. And in this longitudinal study that was led by Annie Park, it's a study of culture. And what we did was, at the very beginning of the year, we gave kids the kind of culture survey that you often find that business school professors give out. And there were a number of statements that kids could endorse as being true or not true about their school. And for example, one statement was, in my school, making mistakes is okay as long as we're learning. And those were statements like that we had identified as growth oriented. And then there were opposite kind of statements, which, like, in my school, the kids who are smarter get treated better. My school really matters is, like, not making mistakes and showing that you're a smart person. And what we found is that it was a growth oriented school culture, not a performance oriented school culture, that led to measurable increases in grit, which then explained increases in GPA, again, according to school records over the course of the year. So I began by saying, like, any of these character strengths of heart, mind, and will, I believe are malleable. I believe that we can, as adults, encourage them. I believe that it's our responsibility to help kids adopt adaptive and accurate mindsets, to develop skill sets and habits that are going to serve them well. But it really all does come down to context, because given the culture of your school, given what adults are saying to you, given your objective opportunities, we're either going to incline kids in positive ways or the opposite. And with that, I will put this book back on the shelf of strengths of character, which could fill, a whole book shelf, a whole wall of books. And I want to say that, earlier today, Tom and I had an opportunity to talk about some of his really exciting new work. And I would say that, like, one of the things that I missed as a teacher was just the spirit of scientific endeavor. I was a bio major, and, I had been trained as a kind of budding scientist to really think of everything as an experiment, and to, like, look for data and try to test hypotheses. And if we could introduce that culture of experimentation and of learning into education, I think, miracles really would happen. And Character Lab, this nonprofit, has a research network of schools and researchers like Carol Dweck and David Yeager to make that a reality. If you want to learn more as an educator or as a researcher, you can go to our website. It's 100% philanthropically funded, so there are no advertisements or annoying pop-ups. And we try to translate as well the insights into non-jargony language so that all of us can create contexts in which children thrive. I'll end with gratitude to the many individuals, and especially the foundations that have been supporting this work and making it possible to deliver everything that we do without charge to parents and educators. And with that, Tom, I'm going to stop sharing my slides, and hopefully we'll have some time for conversation. Oh, I think you're muted. Unless something's wrong with my, okay, good. I was like, unless something's wrong with my computer.
I'm sorry, I've done that multiple times today. So I was just going to remind people, if you have a question and you're on Zoom, raise your hand. I see we already have some hands up. If you're on the YouTube channel watching this, send an email to the PIER fellowship, PIER_fellowship at gse.harvard.edu.
PIER.
Yes, PIER.
Which they should know, but anyway, yeah.
So why don't I start with Jeremy Luna?
Sure, Angela, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us about this. I think this is very important work. And I wanted to ask regarding the context part. How do you create a context. I know that this is really important in schools, in elementary and middle schools, but I found that even here at Harvard, we're pretty susceptible to negative talk or sort of having a context where we don't sort of see ourselves as people of growth mindset. But how do you create a context in your learning space here, maybe even as a college student, to develop that sort of growth mindset with your peers?
Every leader of any organization of any size always says to me, like, it's not one thing, it's like 1,000 things. That's literally what Seattle Seahawks coach Pete Carroll said to me. But I don't want to tell you 1,000 things. Let me just tell you one thing, right? And it's not one thing, but let me just tell you one as an example. I get rejected a lot, like any academic. Most of my articles get rejected, and they get rejected with these like multi-page, single-spaced, like not only is this boring and obvious, it's also wrong. I'm like, how can it be obvious and also wrong? But anyway, pages and pages of just like how stupid it was that I even thought to submit this paper. And what I try to do with permission of my
things that are obviously wrong.
Yeah, that's true. And maybe that's what I'm submitting, Tom. It's obviously wrong. I'm sure that exact phrase has been used. So here's one thing that you can do to encourage a growth mindset and to model this, right? Because I think so much of human learning comes down to modeling, and that's why teachers and educators play such a primary role, because you're like standing there in front, like you are their role models, right? So I try to model this by sending my rejection letters, like Dear Dr. Duckworth. It is, immediately to like everybody in my lab, including like the 18-year-olds. And then they're like, wow, that's harsh, right? And I'm like, yeah, it is, because I don't want them to think everything's perfect, right? I want them to see me get mad, get defensive, then a day later, take a breath, be like, all right, let's print out these reviews and read them. And actually, to Tom's point, I'll just say, like, or maybe it's not, but I think Tom would agree. Like, usually, like, at least 80% of things they're saying are just valid. You're like, yeah, it's a good point. Like, hadn't thought about that. Like, yeah, that first paragraph was totally unintelligible. So I do think modeling a growth mindset by showing your mistakes and showing that you can learn from them, right? I think is one of many things that you do to create a growth mindset culture.
So I'm keeping a list here. So in order, Mark Chin, Christina Cho, Jalicia Singleton, and Monica Higgins. So Mark.
Hi, Dr. Duckworth. Thank you for your presentation. I am a doc student at Harvard, and I study individuals' racial attitudes. And I'm really curious about your thoughts about, given our current climate where we have a lot of folks who seem to be in leadership who are not as willing to compromise on beliefs. And I'm thinking about the big 5 personality traits, and a lot of your work has been grit, and how grit can improve equity in our country. I'm just curious, do you in your lab work, how do you in your lab work with other groups on other parts of the big 5 personality traits? And what do you think is integral or most important for improving equity in our society, given that we do focus a lot on Black and brown kids and their grit, but also sort of ignore a lot of the character skills of more privileged individuals in our society?
Yeah, and there's a lot there in that question, Mark. I mean, just this week I wrote an essay. So every week I write an essay for Character Lab, and we email it out. If you want to get it, you can just go to our website and like put in your email address. This week I wrote about how, like, because I write a lot and talk a lot about grit, because it's like what I study as a scientist, people might think that's the only thing that matters to me as a mom or as an educator. And I wrote my essay about how, like, that's understandable, and that means I should be talking about other aspects of character development than just grit. Let me just say that if I had to pick one other strength of character that was really like at the top, right, like the queen of the queens of character, I would say it's integrity, right? Like without it, I mean, I'd rather have a leader who lacked grit than a leader who lacks integrity. It's not my job to be an op-ed here, but I do think we should all go out and vote in November. Vote your conscience, whatever it is. And I do think that this is why I like to like show this big bookshelf, etc. So my guess is this, is that that when we think about like the healthy development of children, if we can really check those boxes, as it were, like, is this kid developing strengths of heart, like empathy and compassion and integrity and honesty, like things that are really good for other people's, you know, livelihoods, like not just, and if they are really developing strengths of mind, like curiosity, intellectual humility, right? Being able to say like, yeah, I was wrong. Like I was wrong. My perspective was limited. Creativity, imagination. And then, yeah, you know, delayed gratification, self-control, grit, strengths of will. If you can really go and say like, if our leaders could check those 3 boxes in some way, if our children, if our teachers, if our schools culturally, I have to believe it would be a better place. And so it's not a full answer to your question, Mark, but it does suggest at least it's a framework, right? To begin to think about healthy development and healthy leadership.
Christina.
Yes, thank you, Tom. So hi, Dr. Duckworth. My name is Christina Cho. I actually taught in Philly for 8 years, and you spoke at one of my kids' graduation. It's at Boys Latin.
Oh yeah, love Boys Latin.
Yeah. So I remember you spoke at their graduation, so it's good to see you. I guess my question is, and I've been kind of considering this, I'm in the EDLD program at Harvard, and my interest is in trauma, so I want to work with traumatized youth. And I'm wondering if you see any type of relationship between character building, particularly as it relates to marginalized communities and the types of traumas that they face.
Well, you may be familiar with Evelyn Chen and Greg Miller's work at Northwestern. They have studied the long-lasting effects of trauma on young people, and one of the things that I think is really important, especially in the context of grit and talking about race and lack of opportunity, is that in their research, which I encourage you to Google and read up on, you know, there are sometimes it's like sometimes a double-edged sword to be a resilient, hardworking kid who is from a marginalized group, who is like, you know, experiencing a lot of adversity. But in part, it's because it is thought, and again, they're the experts, not me, that there can be like a toll on even like, and sometimes scientists call this allostatic load, when you are chronically stressed in ways that are like really never alleviated, right? It's not like, oh, I'm being chased by a bear, great. Now I'm not being chased by a bear, but like chronic stress. And I do think that being marginalized from like feeling over and over and over and over again that you don't fit in here, that you don't belong, and that you're not even an equal person, that like your voice doesn't matter, you know, that kind of stress, I have to wonder whether it's even more toxic than like, oh my gosh, I'm being chased by a bear, like, you know, and now it's over. So I do think that in their research, they're finding that sometimes these resilient kids can go to college, but they actually find, you know, immune function and other, you know, wear and tear on the system that's really important. So there too, I think the answer has to be like fundamentally about changing the context, right? It's not about going and giving like a 20-minute grit training or even a growth mindset training. It's really about making the worlds that kids are growing up in places where it's adaptive, it's rational, it's like logical to, you know, try hard, set long-term goals because you think the future is even available to you, etc.
Jalicia.
Hello, thank you so much for your presentation. I was really struck by the image of the students. And there was in particular a student watching football and a student like on a YouTube screen. And so I was curious about like, what do they, like how are we learning from students about what they want to be expert in? And how can we build growth mindsets within our systems from learning from students about what they want in education? Because I was also struck by your language around students needing to learn from adults and like trying to figure out how we make that more of a reciprocal relationship where students are growing in schools and schools are growing with students.
Schools are like learning from the students. Yeah, I mean, I'll try to be careful in my language here because I don't want to be taken the wrong way. Look, I started out thinking like, oh, how do I increase academic achievement? And then as a scientist, you're like, how do I measure it? Like, well, grades, right? Or sometimes test scores. But I was more interested in grades because grades are a more accurate reflection of student effort than achievement test scores. So I was like, okay, grades. But I will tell you, I'm 50 and I've been doing this for a while, and I am less and less enchanted by traditional metrics like grades, in part because, you know, first of all, the quality of education that we're giving kids is so bad that, like, when you walk into the classroom, you're like, I wouldn't care either. This is terrible. Like, of course you don't care. You're too smart to care about this awful education that you're getting. And secondly, if you think about the millions of jobs that kids could grow up to have, right? And then you think about the 6 core subjects that our schools are getting, like, there's a mismatch here. Like, kids are likely to be interested in media and broadcasters and like filming, like, there's like a million things, right? Sociology, nobody teaches sociology to high school students. Like, you know, like civic activism, like there's not a class on that. So I've been increasingly dissatisfied with GPA as an outcome variable, and yet I've really struggled to figure out like how to measure things differently. So just to like honor this question, Delicia, but like I'll just say, like, I think you're right. And in research studies, if you measure kids' motivation, here's what they say when they are doing academic work. They're like, this is really hard and it's good for me, but I don't want to do it. And when you measure when they're doing any kind of extracurricular activity, including paid work, honestly, they're like, this is really hard and it's important in my life, and it's important and I want to do it. So I think it's increasingly thinking about broadening the scope of like what we're asking kids to learn, and then learning from them, like listening to them, like, what do you care about? Oh, you're watching football? Tell me why that's interesting to you, is exactly the direction we should all be going in.
Monica is next on my list.
Hey,
Monica.
Angela, welcome back. It's great to see you. So appreciate you
Hello.
being here. I feel like I'm going to be asking you a question the last time we visited Harvard that we might even have talked about, but I'm going to go there anyway because I'm sure you've learned a lot. It's around the skill of expert practice and that positive self-fueling cycle you talked about, and how you can kind of prime students to get into that mode and actually intervene to enable them to. But there's this piece in there which doesn't depend on just the student and themselves. It's the getting feedback. It's not the reflecting, it's the getting feedback, which of course depends on the feedback giver, and there's so much research on feedback. But I'm wondering what you've learned about that we can take into consideration, because of course, teachers in education, we need to give feedback a lot.
Yeah, and by the way, we don't give it enough. Like, you know, I'm mindful that this is a live broadcast. It's like my daughters attended Philadelphia public schools, and I will just say that when I was looking at, for example, the frequency of feedback on writing, right? Like, you only become a better writer when you get feedback on writing. When someone says, like, I didn't understand this sentence, and like, this part seemed just a little long to me, and by the way, like, that's not the right verb tense for this like sentence. Like, let me just say carefully that she didn't get neither of my girls got a lot of feedback, and not a lot of frequent feedback. So one thing that we're not doing as educators is, I think, giving feedback the way, for example, athletes get feedback, right? It's not like, you like practice foul shots and then like 4 months later you get to see whether the basketball got in or not, right? So frequency, I think, should go up. But the other thing that needs to go up is like how helpful the feedback is, right? So so much of our feedback is like, you got a B+. That's it, right? Like, how does anybody learn from I got a B+? All I do is I feel like, I don't know, whatever, I got a B+. So I think specific feedback, right? Informational feedback. And then finally, I'll just, talk about the work of David Yeager, Jeff Cohen, and others. They did a WISE feedback study. What they found is that if you put Post-it notes, right, on essays that kids get back, and the Post-it note says, I'm giving you this feedback because I have high standards and I know you can achieve them. The kids who get that Post-it note on the same essay feedback as other kids who get a Post-it note which just says, I'm giving you this feedback because it's important to give you feedback, or something like, just kind of this standard teacherese. The kids in this Post-it note where it was like, I have my standards, I know you can achieve them, actually revised their essays more, and in some subsequent experiments, like, actually did better in class. And I just think that what that says is, not that we should all go out and buy Post-its, but what teachers need to communicate, especially I think to kids who have been historically marginalized and underserved, is that we do have high standards and we know that they can achieve them, and signaling that in every way that we can. For example, when kids get that B+, instead of being like, oh, you got a B+, is there a way that the kid can like try again and then get to an A- and try again and get to mastery, right? So there's a lot of structural things that we can do with our the way we design assessment and curriculum and the way we track kids, et cetera. But I also think there are a lot of micro moments where teachers can communicate to kids like, I respect you, I believe in you, I know that you can learn, and, it's our job to get you to where you need to be.
Thank you.
Elise.
Thank you so much. One of the, I guess, things that I've been hearing a lot about recently is this conversation that placing importance on teaching grit is really just like another version of the bootstrapping narrative, saying that like, work harder, be better. And I would just be like curious to hear your response to that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm frankly horrified that like the research could be interpreted that way, but I think it's a really good point, because I think it is sometimes misinterpreted as like, we don't need, equal funding in schools. We just need grit. Like, we don't need like a decent reading curriculum. We just need grit. We don't need laptops for all students. We just need grit. And like, no, that's so wrong. And I was recently in dialogue with Bettina Love, who's actually written about how, this research can be misused, and especially against Black students. And I was mostly just agreeing with her and trying to take some responsibility really in like amplifying her message, which is that, anything that we would say to a Black and brown student, we should say to any student, because human nature is about being human. And I think the mechanics of achievement are really the same mechanics. It's just there's disparity in opportunity, right? So I think it's a really important point, and I hope, at least to clarify, my position is that, that we ought not be preaching to any one subgroup of kids. We ought not to be stigmatizing certain kids. And really the responsibility is always ultimately our responsibility. And by the way, physically, it is not possible to pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
I'm laughing because when I was a child, one of my father's friends offered to pay me $20 if I could pick myself up. And I as a young child, I may not have been strong on the intellect scale, but I was very strong on the grit scale. So I actually tried.
Yeah.
I didn't give up 2 weeks. Yeah. So next up is Amy, then Elizabeth, then Jose.
Hi. So I actually had a similar question to Elise about like that narrative of grit reinforcing individualism. And I guess I wonder too, as a researcher, how to, I guess if you could go back, or if there was any way that you could like shape that dialogue a little bit differently. Because I think, once it becomes a big buzzword and then it just kind of takes off with various journalists and people weighing in. And then I also wanted to ask about, like, you had mentioned the measures of cultures that were at schools that were more growth oriented versus performance oriented. And I guess I was just curious with like different types of school culture surveys. I know a lot of school leaders might look at like disparities among like subgroups of students. Like, do the white students answer this differently than the Black, Latinx, Asian students, or the ELL students or special education students? So I guess I'm just curious about how that factors into this conversation about grit.
Yeah, those are two really good questions. I'll answer the second one first. I don't know, and we didn't actually have enough statistical power to disaggregate the culture questions by ethnic subgroup, but I think it's a really good question. I think there must be important work that I don't know about how kids in the same school building, or like in the same object, like could experience something different for lots of reasons, by the way, including being treated differently. So I think it's a really good question. In terms of changing the narrative, I mean, I think I am realizing now, I mean, I can't go back in time. Like, I don't think I ever said in print or in speech, like, you should pull yourself up by your bootstraps, or like, like context doesn't matter. But what I want to say in 2020 is like, that doesn't matter. Like, what matters is what people are hearing. And that just means that I'm responsible, right? Like, you can't like give a TED talk and then like, and write a book and then not take responsibility for having a public influence. And so I'm just trying to learn a little bit more. And, I've been in conversation with people like Jeff Duncan Andrade. I think Bettina Love's a great researcher, by the way. And she's a professor of education, for those of you who don't know, University of Georgia. And having a little intellectual humility. I will say it's easier for me, maybe because, not easier, but I'm the head of character lab. So I often have like defensive, small-minded, feelings. I'm like, my feelings are hurt. Like, don't say, but I'm the head of character lab. So I'm like, what would a person with integrity, humility, curiosity, and empathy like do at a time like this? And I'm just trying to, do my best there.
Elizabeth Cetrin.
Thanks so much, Angela. This is really great. I was thinking a bit about differences between individuals' character skills and also organizations or cultures' character skills. So I'm a professor, for example, so like thinking about lab environments or classrooms, like I guess if you could speak a bit about either research that's been done on improving either character values, or I don't even know if you could call it character skills of subcultures or cultures, and how that might be different from individual interventions.
I'm in the middle of revising, and I was working on it today, a paper about grit within the organizational context. And one of the things that I say in that paper, it's a first author paper by a graduate student, but so I think one thing that matters is leadership, right? So I really do believe that we're all role models for each other, but a classroom teacher, because everybody is like, that's a leader. It's like everybody's, so you have a special responsibility, and then the principal has a special responsibility, because so I do think leadership has to model the values, the mindsets, the skill sets that, would trickle down. Ralph Waldo Emerson said that an organization is merely the long extended shadow of its leader. And so I do believe that, that's why we should all vote in November. I mean, you really do need like great role models, I think, who are inspiring examples for you on a day-to-day basis. That's one thing. And then I guess I'll just highlight one other thing that we said. We talked a lot about culture, but we already covered that a little bit in this conversation. I really do think there are structural things in the work context. It could be job design, right? Like, are you rewarded for taking risk and like learning, or are you always just compared to, your other employees in the kind of rank order ways that do not promote a growth mindset, et cetera? And I think in higher education, for example, like I had to teach a class, like everyone has to teach, as you know, and I petitioned the registrar and my deans to make it pass-fail only. And they were like, pass-fail only? Like, we don't even know if the computer system can handle pass-fail only. And I was like, well, just see. And so they were like, okay, the computer system can handle it. And I was like, okay, great, my class is pass-fail only. And they're like, oh, the kids aren't going to work hard. And I will tell you, I've taught this class now, this is my second semester, and there are all kinds of ways to motivate students without like hanging the sword of their grades over them. And so maybe there are structural things that we can design that aren't just about modeling, et cetera, that really incentivize like learning for learning's sake and not for comparison or grade sake.
So Josie, I'm sorry, I had written in my notes Jose, and I'd left out the I, and now I realize I misspelled your name. So sorry.
No worries, no worries. Actually, my question follows right with Elizabeth. So I know one of the reasons why people get very nervous about talking about grit is because it seems like that the focus is really on the student who is responsible for their own success. And so thank you for nodding that context and culture matters. So my question is sort of related to, in environments that have more of a fixed mindset, do you have any sort of training or modules for students to be able to kind of adapt within those type of contexts? For example, like self-advocacy skills.
One of the reasons, so we just talked about how, the research on grit could be misinterpreted. It could be, an excuse for like not actually investing in all the things that we need to invest in schools. But I'll tell you one reason I am still motivated to work on what I could help the individual student do. I mean, there are kids in 8th grade right now that are not like, it's not like the high school landscape is going to change overnight, right? And I worry about those kids. I'm like, what can I give that kid when they go to 9th grade, given that I can't change the school funding in their district and I can't like rearrange all the teachers the way I want. So, as a psychologist, I feel like the same way educators do, right? Like we should try to change the system. And for the kids who are still in the system that is not yet changed, we should try to help them. So in terms of growth mindset, let me direct you to some resources. So a graduate student of Carol's who got his PhD and then started a nonprofit, started PIER, PERTS. And I'm sorry, Dave, because I can't remember what PERT stands for, but this is Dave Paunescu, and you can go to perts.org, and they actually have nationally tested growth mindset stuff for educators. I think they have some for school leaders, etc. We link to it through characterlab.org, so that's another place you can look for. And I will also say that, to me, the reason why this, I love PIER, I love the whole philosophy of PIER, but also even just this very webinar that we're in, is that my core belief as a psychologist is if you can understand something in a really deep way, that's when you can do something with it. So in terms of professional development for teachers, rather than saying hey, here's this thing, just go do it for 4 hours, it's they should understand the neuroscience of growth mindset. Teachers are as smart as anyone. So I feel like the future for professional development could be basically some version of this, right? Where we're really getting into at a deeper level, what is going on, the psychology, the sociology of schools, et cetera. And then the teachers can be creative and in their context, in authentic ways and in 1,000 ways, right? Create growth mindset oriented schools and more.
So now we've got a couple of questions from the YouTube audience. And this is from somebody who has a username that I can't really use on air.
Okay, I can't wait to hear what their question is.
No, but it's a very strong question. It's not that it's a vulgar name. It's just it's pejorative. So what does it mean for a school to have a stronger culture of growth mindset? And how do they build that? Is it, in a mission statement, posters on the wall, elements of staff PD? How do schools build a culture of growth mindset?
So I know this question is about schools. I'm going to cheat a little bit and just give you 2 examples about classroom culture, just because I know these examples, well, they're just inspiring to me. So I met these 2 teachers, one Phil Bressler, who teaches in Baltimore, and the other Anthony Yam, who's LA Unified School District. I met them because they're both actually AP teachers, and they are outliers. They have set records in the number of kids that have not only gotten 5 out of 5. I think actually one year, Anthony Yam, he goes by Yam, email, he's oh, this year, literally all 5s, across the board. And by the way, this is LA Unified School District. And by the way, it's East LA. And by the way, I think something like half of his kids come from families that are working, migrant farm working employment. And so what are these teachers doing to create a growth mindset to help kids be their best and to show how smart they really are? Well, Yam has these things called I think they're correction binders, maybe he calls them mistake binders. And for every test that you take, this is a pre-COVID example, but there's the version of this that you can imagine doing online. Anytime a kid takes a quiz or a test, it goes into the binder. And when they do their corrections, when they rework the problem and revisit or find their mistake and do it the right way, they get half credit back, right? That is a structural change that incentivizes kids not to shove the test into their backpack, never to be seen again, but to take the feedback, think what can I learn from it, and to proceed. So that's one example of a structural change which creates a classroom culture of continuous improvement and learning. And the other example is Phil Bressler. So Phil is another amazing teacher, and he has this he's teaching online like so many teachers right now. So he's converting all this to virtual, but he does 2 things that I just want to highlight. One is that on his board, he has this little sign that says in chalk, Bressler's Blunders, because the last name is Bressler. And he got this idea from another teacher. But basically every time he makes a mistake, he teaches AP Econ, there's a point, and it's a point and when they get to a certain number of points, the class gets to celebrate and have pizza. But it's just a way to basically be yeah, everyone makes mistakes. This is great. Yay, I made 20 mistakes. Awesome. Let's all have a pizza party, right? And so it's that kind of classroom culture in very creative ways. I would never have come up with either of these ideas. This is kind of why I feel schools of education need actual educators, right? Because I don't think the innovation primarily is coming from Tom and Angela, so those are just two vivid examples. But I think the last thing I'll just say is that Phil also, as a matter of culture building, I told you I send out a little letter, like a little essay. It's one scientific insight that can be, actionable that week. He started getting these as an educator. He was like, I really like these. And I was like, great. And he was like, I'm going to do them. I was like, great. So he started sending out his own little note to his students. Every week, Phil writes a note to his students, and all of his former students get it too. And it's like one thing he just wants to talk to them about. And it's very personal. And those are the kinds of things like, okay, write a note to your kids every week, talk about, make fun of, and laugh about, and celebrate your mistakes. And then create structures where you are incentivized to learn from your mistakes and not hide them. Those are things I think that are not only about classroom culture, they are also about school culture.
So speaking of teaching in a virtual setting, Elise Henkel online asks, what are your recommendations for measuring SEL character traits for students in a virtual setting? I'm working with a reading tutoring program, and we're trying to measure character in our very young students, K-3, but are struggling to find a good tool to do this with in a virtual setting.
Well, you and me both. On the topic of measurement, I would just say it's so hard to do well. I don't know that we can do it well. We can only do it poorly, but it's even hard to do that. And I'll just maybe say this. You can look at my website. I've written a lot about measurement, and I've written articles. I think it was I was at a White House meeting. I should say, under the Obama administration, I was at a White House meeting, and I was asked to write a paper on measurement for educators, and I did it with David Yeager. So you can read all that stuff. But here's the one thing I was to say about measurement. I understand why we want to measure things. I want to measure things. I'm a researcher. But I think we should be careful, because it is so hard to do well. You can sometimes do more harm than good when the measure is misinterpreted, when people think it's more precise than it is, and especially when you talk about social emotional learning and character, sometimes people think like if you can measure it, then like all of a sudden magic wand, you'll know how to cultivate it. But I don't think it's that easy. So, until we have really good tools for schools, for leaders, for educators, and for parents about how to build these things, I'm putting more of my energy these days into developing these capabilities than to, building better microscopes for assessing them.
So we have, I think, time for one more question, and before we thank Angela for such a stimulating talk, and that last question goes to Isabella Fonte.
Hi, thank you so much, and I really appreciate your comment on measurement. That was very aligned with my question. I was curious if you'd looked into any qualitative ways of measuring grit. As sort of a measure that might incorporate more context, as you said, that's really important for measuring.
Yeah, not yet is the short answer, but I did do a partnership with the Common App, and the Common App has, of course, every year it changes like what the required essays are. But the year where we got all the data was 2009, and the kids all wrote 150 words about their activities outside of school. And so we used artificial intelligence to code these for things like perseverance and also learning and pro-social motivation, et cetera. And one of the things I will tell you is that like it's encouraging, like you can get a little bit of signal. But the other thing I'll just say is that there's a lot of noise. And one thing that's really important to underscore is that when you just look at what kids write about, it's so often like when you're applying to college, what occurs to you is, was I on student council? Like, did I play for the tennis team? But I think what's not being said in these 150-word essays, but needs to be signaled to students that like we care, is like, what are the other responsibilities that you might have that really demonstrate that you're a hardworking person, that you have a conscience, that you're not, and like we need to find ways to give them not just permission, but encouragement to write about taking care of their little brother, pain in the butt that he is, 4 days a week because your mom's working a second shift. Like those kinds of things are not coming out, I think, in these essays. And that says to me that we have a lot of work to do.
So thank you very much, Angela, for joining us. Like, so as you hinted, I think I've been thinking about some of these ideas at an organizational level. So what would deliberate practice look like at an organizational level? And I think it's about the kinds of things that you're trying to do, that we're trying to do, and that is make it easier for organizations to pilot and test things, to like see whether the things that, the ideas that sound good on paper but aren't quite, they're not sure whether it's going to make a difference for kids, making it possible for organizations to do the learning, to do deliberate practice. And without that, it would be very hard to see how we're going to continue improving. So anyway, I just wanted to thank you, Angela, for joining us today. I wish we were in person and
rain check,
and not just virtual, but we'll definitely take you up on that. So that, love to have you back next year or the following year, when hopefully we could do this kind of thing in person again. So I guess, can we do like some kind of virtual?
You can do jazz hands.
That's right.
Or you could get the like fake applause that they pipe into the NBA bubble. Like apparently all those screams, cheers are like not real.
Yes,
anyway,
we should have
for the next PIER. You know, look into that.
Yeah, wait, don't tell me. Like, I think they have some kind of.
I think it's all fake.
Make people laugh.
Yeah.
So
anyway, I feel very welcome, and I love these questions. What a great community you've built, and so thank you for having me.
Well, thanks, Angela. So just a reminder to the seminar participants, our next seminar is October 20th with Peter Blair. Peter, I think, has been participating in this seminar this week. But thank you, and see you in a couple of weeks.